Hello, everyone. We're super happy to have you joining us here this afternoon, this morning, this evening, wherever you may happen to be joining us from. This is our Aspen Family Business Group webinar on succession. This is the fourth one I think we've done this year as our new nonprofit, and we're rolling out new tools, content for you to succeed and prosper in your family business. Today, Natalie and I will be presenting on succession. As I said, a couple housekeeping notes. We do have the Q&A feature enabled, so please feel free to pop your questions in at any time during the webinar, and we will answer them for you. There's no chat in this webinar. We are recording. You do have the option in the Q&A for your questions to be anonymous, so if you prefer to ask them that way, please do so. We are recording the webinar for future use, so we have great tools for our website and for videos and people to take advantage of. And with that, we will get started. So I just want to start by just acknowledging there are three really common areas that people think about when they talk about succession in family business. Those are leadership, ownership, and management. And these are super important as you talk about transitioning from one generation to the next. But there are actually several other aspects and components of succession. And we're going to get into all 8 of these areas today. These are all distinct areas, but they're also interconnected, right? We can't take any of these by themselves individually. They're all related to the whole larger topic and transition. But we're going to get into each of these. And we're going to also note that all of this takes time, right? And I think everyone's probably pretty aware of this. And when you think you should start planning is probably after you should have started planning. And I'm going to turn it over to Natalie just to chime in on this one as well. And so you get to hear another voice.
Absolutely. Today, we're expanding that definition of succession, right? We tend to think like the CEO leader when we're talking about management here. There's some interesting research in family companies that if you really boil them down, it's not just a landmark company with the family's name. There's usually 3 entities on average. There's an investment entity, a landmark entity with the family's name, and then something else. I like to call it like the founder entrepreneur's hobby relationship. So when you can tease apart succession, you create opportunities instead of this focal point about we all must be, the one person who takes over for mom or dad, which creates a competition in your children. Now, creates is an interesting word because competition in families is actually how we carve out our own space. So I don't know if it creates more than perpetuates that competition dynamic. And so these are the other successions we want to add to those 3 main ones we're just talking about. Governance, and governance is the way we make decisions, as a group instead of just one person. That authority, right? If I wanted to knight, my son or daughter and say, yay, you're the next one, it doesn't mean that everyone will follow. And so figuring out how to get that more nuanced part, we're going to break these all down. But there's values, and that could be family or company. Knowledge, which is literally what we know and who we know it with, and then that relational piece. And so we're not saying you're going to have 8 successors, even though we think of succession as more than just one role. But we are going to say that there are pieces of this, that person in the 3-circle model, at the very, very center. And we've done the 3-circle model again. And if you haven't seen it, absolutely check it out on our website. We like to call Atlas because he or she is like holding up the world. And this says, if you don't want to live and breathe your work 24/7 all the time, sometimes the next generation doesn't want to, although they're great hard workers. How do we tease out those roles and put them with the appropriate people so that it's a sustainable business and livelihood going forward?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point too. And it's our colleague, Leslie Dash, who likes to refer to it as places to plug in. So the whole enterprise needs to transition in all of these aspects. And it might be a lot of people doing these transitions, but there also might be distinct people doing distinct aspects of these transitions. So that's a really good point to keep in mind. And then we look at time, right?
Absolutely. You know, I think it was Confucius, or it's often quoted that Confucius has said this when it's asked, like, when's the best time to plant a tree? And you say, like, 20 years ago. And then the question is, when's the next best time? And it's now. So we've really studied how knowledge passes in general. And there's something called tacit knowledge or heuristic knowledge. And that's Shelley and I are the exact same age, grew up in the same family, went to the same secondary school, went to the same uni, are interested in all the same things. We even played like volleyball together. We have the exact same life. That is all filtered through, that's just data and information, right? For it actually to turn into knowledge, it's filtered through, you know, our biases, our lens of the world, our own lived experience, and turns into that heuristic tacit knowledge that we're looking for successors. And the research says that takes about 10 years to transfer. Right. And you might be saying, hey, I'm leaving the role in 2 years. Fine. We can get a lot of that data and information done in 2 years. But the rest of the feeling like you know that work, to feel like it's second nature, to really embody it, it's going to take a little longer. It's why when we bring governance into the equation and succession, we allow a role for that outcoming senior to be in a place, you know, in 2020, most recently, and the same thing happened in 2008 when we ran into hard times, at least, you know, economically in the United States. We were seeing a trend of reverse succession. We were pulling that person we'd already pushed out the door because we thought they were too stubborn and we were tired of hearing them know it all. We asked them to come back. We asked them to help us. And there's some fascinating, you know, brain research that actually says that people over 55 are smarter. They know more. Wisdom is real. It just takes them a little longer to get to the file cabinets that are hanging out up there. And so we want to make sure when we're talking about succession, we're not pulling the trigger on changing roles because we're not able to collaborate effectively. And we're doing it for the right reasons. And even though they may not be in this role, we promote them to another one where we're still allowing us time, that 10 years that it's going to take to get that wisdom so we don't get in any trouble.
Great. So let's dig in. We've got 8 areas to talk about. In leadership, in a family business, often, you know, you've got sort of the traditional patriarchal or the firstborn son. And so I know who's going to be the next leader of the business. Well, we like to think of it a little bit differently. What does the business really need over the next 5 to 15 years? You know, maybe think about writing a job description for that role. And you might have someone in mind, which is excellent. Maybe what does that person need if they're going to fill that role? And by creating that job description and thinking about what the business really needs, then you're setting that person up for success. So when you look at the developing your leaders, right? Similarly, so what do they need? Maybe you have family members who are working in the business. Maybe you have family members not working in the business. How can you support all of the people in the family enterprise, giving them the skills and the tools that they need and that knowledge, helping them work their way up that knowledge pathway. We'll talk a little bit about knowledge in a minute. And then mentoring is another great role. And there's a lot we could talk about on that. We're actually going to do a webinar on that later on in the year. But that's a great way of developing your next leaders in all sorts of ways, in interpersonal skills, you know, not just gaining the operational knowledge in the business, but helping them navigate through life as an owner or in the boardroom and all those behaviors and what it means to be an owner when your name is on the door in the business and how do you show up. And then throughout your business, right? Leadership in terms of bench strength. Who do you have that's prepared to take over in an unlikely catastrophic event? Or maybe you're building your timelines and you have someone who maybe has a shorter runway. Who's going to be able to fill in next after that? We're going to move on to the ownership and the management pieces. But Natalie, I don't know if you have anything you want to add here.
I thought it might be nice, you know, I've heard you before, Shelley, talk about, you know, 3 ways to think of mentoring. I know there's another webinar later, but if you could just touch on that, that might be helpful.
Sure. Yeah. So Danelle Nunes and I did some work on mentoring and research on mentoring, and we identified that there are 3 areas of need. So we're not calling them types of mentoring, but areas of need in family business. And one is that operational component, right? How do I do my job? Maybe learning other jobs in the company, maybe learning some knowledge, some skills. And that can be from someone inside the business, outside the business. It can be a family member or not. there's a legacy component and a legacy area of need. And that's how are we passing on the history and the values and the culture that's within the family and within the business. And then the third area that I referred to is the interpersonal. That area of need is very important and sometimes not always apparent, how we're going to convey that or how it's needed. And it can be really helpful for that one to have somebody who's very familiar with family business, maybe not in the business, and they can help a rising generation family member navigate, what questions do I ask in the boardroom? When do I speak up? How do I move through the business? Who do I speak to with employees? How do I show up? How do I handle myself? And lots of these things, people can learn by observing and by doing if they have good role models. But also it's really great to be intentional about some of these areas as well. And as I mentioned, the mentors can come from anywhere, and there's an approach to looking for mentors, but also they can be all the same person. You can have 3 mentors, you can have 5 mentors. So there's no rule around that, but we did identify these 3 areas where mentoring can be super helpful.
Absolutely. Thanks, Shelley. And one of the things, this is really focused on succession today. But as we're really thinking about bench strength, it's important to know that, we can broaden this out for opportunities to exit. One of the reasons that families, when they say, I don't want to burden my kids, which being a successor is a unique burden as well as a blessing. So it's not always a bad thing, but I'd like out, a buyer's looking for this too. And a lot of us, if we don't have good bench strength, that's not just in our C-suite, that's in our VPs or our directors, that's the level beyond. Succession is everyone's job. You're not really going to find a buyer for the price point that hits the value that you've actually put into it. So a lot of these things, we said, yes, start 10 years ago if you could have. We're also saying this is just the thing that you need to get out whatever your option is. I've had some clients that, transitioned out as an ESOP as well. And so all of these things apply, even if you don't know exactly that you will transfer to your next generation or even to a family member, we're still going to use these same tools. The role is that, a lot of my clients say this. Sometimes they say, if I die, I don't want to remind you of mortality, but the answer is when you die, or hopefully better yet, when you get to enjoy the fruits of your labor, we're going to want to do these things.
Yeah. And then the last item on this slide was, you referenced earlier that there's a lot that the older individuals can contribute, even when their time has come maybe to step away and make room for the rising generation. There's, great opportunities for collaboration there as well.
Absolutely. EY and several other organizations have done studies on the average age of successor. And I hate to burst your bubble. Some of you are going to hang up after I've said this because you're like, I've been telling my dad or mom that that's not true. It's roughly for the next generation family member 45. Right. And that's because you're getting closer to also having your own wisdom, having differentiated and things like that. So there's going to be a period of time when you're in the company where you're hopefully getting increasing knowledge, increasing responsibility, increasing authority, leadership, etc. But you may not be the guy or gal in charge.
Okay. So ownership. Natalie, I'm going to let you carry this one for us.
Yeah, ownership varies country by country. Ownership varies actually in the United States, state by state as well. But there are some really specific rights and responsibilities. And one of the things I always hear when I talk to my next gen is they often focus on the rights and not necessarily the responsibilities. I'll say things like, you want a $10,000 distribution? Everyone's like, yes. You want $1 million distribution? Everyone's like, yes. And then it's like, do you want to secure the debt of the business? And everyone's hands magically are underneath them. And so that responsibility of owners isn't just that your right is, yes, information, which means P&Ls, full financial information. That's one of your basic rights in the United States. Also in Australia, the UK, and Canada. So information is the very first one. A financial return is another one. The other right usually is to pick the C-suite or the board, if you defer the right to the board to pick the C-suite. And the last one is mergers and acquisitions. Those are the 4 we all agree on. There are a couple more depending on the state and the country that you live in, which involves the most amorphous one of these, which is the right of company culture change, which is hard to know exactly what that company culture change is, and a couple more. But it's really important to say in a family company that the ownership succession doesn't have to mirror the management succession. So I was actually working with a client the other week where, there's 6 kids, 2 are in the business, 1 recently came into the business, 1's thinking about it, and 2 are like never, right? That's 6. That's how math works. Yeah. So there's 6 of them, 2 in, 1 just came, but 2 been in there for a long time. 1 might come. And, what the mother and father said is, we know who the CEO is. And we've said that she's the CEO. They just did that right before I got there. And we think because she's the CEO, she also needs to be the majority owner. I couldn't have run this business if I wasn't the majority owner. In fact, I bought my siblings out. And I said, yeah, today she is the CEO. She may not be, though. The family has a wide range of ages. It might be that one of the 2 next middle siblings who want to join the company could later be the CEO. That you are saying ownership equals control, and it kind of does, but only about those few things I just mentioned, not about the day to day. We want to think about this differently. And so in the conversations with the family, they decided that they would all be equal owners, even the kids who are not in the company. Now, there might be some controls around the voting shares, but those are very separate things. And so when we talk about that 3-circle model we mentioned, using that in your planning is really helpful. What's the goal? The goal of the entire family was that we weren't going to hamstring this business by doing too big of distributions. We were going to continue to reinvest in the company. And if we can all as owners align on that, it doesn't much matter who the main owner is. But so educating ownership and saying that they don't have to be the exact same one. So in this family, that there is the one CEO that the whole family respects, does worry about what it's like to work for my sister instead of my dad. Yet they're all going to be able to ask those ownership questions and get that financial information they didn't. And so that's one of the ways we think about this. And yeah, absolutely. When you make an ownership change, you have to change these agreements. A lot of my clients don't have shareholder agreements or stockholder agreements because there was 1 shareholder, 1 stockholder. And so the question is, if we're inviting people in, how do we get in? How do we get out? How does this impact my own estate planning? And that's actually, I think, our next webinar. It's not our next, it'll be soon, of what that estate planning means. If you're saying it's my shares, do they go to my kids? Do they go to my spouse? And jointly deciding on that. And, the question is often, yes, it probably does go to your kids. It's murkier with spouses because how we think about this family asset. And so there's a lot of structure in the ownership, so much structure that sometimes it's confusing. You're talking to lawyers that we don't really pay attention to this side as much as the conversation that we just had around
Right.
the issue.
Yeah, and those are really important conversations for the family to have themselves, right? What are our goals? How do we want to view ownership? Who's entitled to own shares, right? When we're talking about the shareholders agreement, have a mechanism in that shareholders agreement for how to value those shares so that everyone's in alignment right now. And we want everyone to be in alignment and agreement and happy down the road when someone passes away or is passing on their shares or selling their shares. And so what is going to be the mechanism for valuing those shares and setting that up ahead of time so that you can make sure that there's you eliminate potential friction going down the road. And as you said, those things, those conversations with the lawyers, and sometimes those are hard things to talk about, these topics, but having those family conversations first, I find, is very helpful before you even go speak to the attorney, and then they can help you clarify further.
Absolutely. We don't have it uploaded yet, but we have a decision tree around, the 8 to 12 main questions that are in shareholder agreements. And it's a lot easier to discuss that in plain English. It also levels the playing field because, interestingly enough, most of my clients actually have 1 lawyer in the family. So there's 1 person who seems to know it better, and that's not helpful for these discussions. And to Shelley's point, yeah, this conversation of whether what's equal or equitable or fair versus equal, that first conversation with this client, the example, the thought was, not only would they be the main owner, it's because they're working on it, right? So they should get the main distributions, but it's everyone's capital at risk, right? And so could they get more? Maybe. Should it be all? I don't know. And so we have to have that conversation. We raise our kids saying that we love you equally, right? And we say things like it, whatever your holiday is, whether it's Hanukkah or Christmas, we say things like, now there might be a different number of presents, they might be different sizes, but the value's the same. We spent the same, right? So that's why you can tell my age when I say this, when you get your tiny little iPod mini, when you're the older sibling and the younger sibling's got like 10 presents, it's because that little iPod mini costs a whole lot more than their 10 presents. And so that's a really interesting change when you become adults, of saying, you can understand this nuance, but let's talk about it. so we don't start resenting these differences, because differences only make a meaningful difference in your life if you add extra reasoning as to why. And yeah, you can absolutely work as the leader without ownership control. Hopefully your brothers and sisters aren't going to threaten to fire you every time you make them unhappy.
Right. And, and that's an important part of governance and what governance looks like and what governance means, right? Which that's why we take this all as a package of all of these elements, which are interrelated. And we need to consider how we're going to view the overarching governance of all the circles and the systems. So control might not be important as long as we have a good governance structure. Ownership control might not be important as the leader of the enterprise, as long as you have those other good governance structures in place. Okay, management. So, as we talked about bench strength in the same kind of way, right? We need to think about everyone else in the business, whether they're family members or non-family members. There's one or maybe you're going to have co-presidents or co-CEOs, but you have a lot of other really important roles in the business as well. What are their ages? Are they getting, was everyone sort of in at the same time? And so everyone's aging out. You might have a whole lot of institutional knowledge in a CFO or some other key leaders. And so we need to really focus on transitioning those roles as well, bringing up people from within, hiring from without, however it's going to look like. But you need to really create so there are no gaps and carrying along, especially if there's a new person in one or two roles. Maybe we don't want all the roles to change at the same time. So how is that going to look? And being mindful of long-term employees, when you have next generation family members coming in and some of your employees have maybe been there 30 or 35 years and they remember little Susie or Johnny, when they were running around and playing pranks or being a teenager or whatever. And now the rising generation family members, they need to come in and show up and gain the respect and acknowledgement of all that they are prepared for the role and well suited to the role, and coming in a way that still makes the long-term employees feel good and secure about their roles. And we find a lot of times, I know Natalie can agree with this, where in a family business, a lot of the employees are very reassured. They're very happy to know that there's continuity, that there is a family, that the families have a plan and they're grooming or preparing the leadership to continue in the family, because that alleviates some unknowns, right? Some uncertainties. They know who that person is. They think maybe they could be a little bit more developed, but they understand, they know the values of the family and the employees value the family culture. So that's very reassuring to know that will continue. So should we move on to?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's get into the things that we told you need to think about, right? But aren't always there in the front and center. Natalie, I'll let you start on this one.
Absolutely. Governance is just how we make decisions when we go from one to many, and many can be two. I was just talking to a different client a week ago where he has only two siblings in the business, both incredible leaders, and he decided to give them 50-50 ownership. And my suggestion is that 2% goes into trust. And he said, why? And I said, because in a 50-50, whether it's either co-trustees or 50-50 ownership, you both have to make the decision. You both have to make the decision on those owners' rights, like who's the CEO, to sell the business, to not sell the business, what the distributions will be or not be. And at the end of the day, if anything doesn't go right, they can't make a decision. It cannot be one of you. And I've seen clients locked into that at times. And it's not to say that I don't hope we work with you and you guys figure it out and we're collaborative. But on our worst days, we might not be. That's why power really works as one. When it goes to many, you're making joint decisions. And that's all governance means. It's joint decisions. And it's saying, where are the most appropriate joint decisions? And we talk about how we wear many hats in family companies. We wear the hat as the main manager, right? That C-suite person. We wear the hat as the owner, right? And sometimes those are in really good, healthy tension, right? I, as an owner, may want some distributions, and I, as a manager, may want to keep more capital in the company for growth. There should be a healthy dialogue and debate about that, right? And it's not that one side is right or wrong, and usually something moves in the middle. And often that's the role of the board, right? The board's job is to listen to the owners and help give strategic direction to the company. And so these governance bodies don't have to happen tomorrow. If you have a family of 4 adult children, you probably don't need any of these. Maybe a board because that helps in the question of succession. You have some outside executives on that board saying, you're not playing favorites. This is objectively who's the more qualified person to lead. But as the family grows, you're going to want an owner's council that represents the owners. And if you have an S corp, in most states, you can get up to 100 shareholders. It's a lot of people who aren't going to make these decisions right away. Also, a lot of people aren't interested in making those decisions right now or are educated to do that. And again, we're not talking about a state this time, but a lot of times for estate planning purposes, your 6-month-old children are shareholders technically, and they're not qualified to make those decisions, right? So the Owners Council is a small represented elective group of owners who help make those decisions that they're delegated to do. There may be some decisions that the whole owner group has to vote on. The family council starts representing the family. It could be family vacations, could be family values, might have a little to do with family giving. Because again, if you have 100 shareholders, you might have 300 family members if you include spouses and kids who aren't family shareholders yet. And that board really helps supervise the management and make sure when the owners say we would like this, it's feasible. And we use Decision Matrix as a tool. We have a video that will come out with the recording of this for you to see how we can look at those decision-making matrix and say, whose decision is what? Is it collaborative? Do we consult? Do we inform? Again, it doesn't mean we're all going to like these decisions, right? You may be an owner who says, well, I'm an owner, I should get my way, but your viewpoint isn't the one that makes sense here. But we understand who says it, who does it, and that it was at least a fair process, even if I don't like the decision. And that we can eliminate conflict in families is not true. We manage conflict, that we can make everyone happy in families or even organizations that aren't families is also not true. And so this at least says, here's our process. It's not personal. We didn't outvote you because we don't like Natalie. We just, in this case, Natalie's decision wasn't the best one for the company. And that's how we use governance in family and how we do succession for governance in family. Because what usually happens in a family company that's not terribly complex is dad is chairman of the board, dad is the majority owner, and dad is the CEO, or insert mom in those lovely companies we have that have matriarchs. And now you tease them out. And for that person who is all three, it is very hard for them to always think about which hat they're wearing. So it is actually better that they're different people thinking with a different lens as they look at these questions.
Yeah, so 2 points that you made that I want to pick up on, the founder-led company, or maybe even a second generation company where you have the leader, the business leader, the chairman of the board, the primary owner, and then transitioning to the next level, the next generation, there's a challenge to peel back all those layers. And for that person, even if it's all living in one in this generation, we need to communicate and understand how those different roles are going to play out in the subsequent generations when different people might be fulfilling those roles. So gaining clarity on what are the responsibilities and the rights and the obligations of those different roles in that 3-circle model. And then the other thing that you mentioned was, how a board can really support a family business. As you transition to the next generation, I've seen this many times, it's super supportive and helpful for those rising generation family members to have a board in place. Maybe they're going to set it up. Maybe the prior generation set it up, bringing in some independence into that boardroom. And then that gives some it lends accountability. So the rest of the family knows that there's oversight. It also lends a great deal of support to that rising family member and rising leader who might not feel like they have it all figured out. And so now they have the smartest people in the room with them, overseeing, helping them make decisions, supporting them in their journey where they're still developing and they're still learning, even though they may be 45, right? We know it takes time and it's a new job for them and a new position. So it's a great support mechanism as you transition through the generations as well.
It's a great place for mom or dad to not feel like they're not being valued. Often, even though our families have an existing board, you all do. Look at your legal documents, ask your attorney. There is one. It's likely you. Mom or dad, or if it's grandma or grandpa, can sit on that board with these other executives and start having this healthy supervisory and collaborative relationship with the next gen, which it doesn't feel like they're constantly second guessing, because a board is at this 10,000 foot level, right? Versus the day to day. And so this allows that smooth transition over time.
Great. And so, which really brings us very naturally into authority, right? So, how do these transitions happen where everyone in the company is used to going to one person, that one person is used to making all of those decisions? And how do you support those people? You need to, it's not just the rising gens or the person who's taking over those roles that they want to be able to make those decisions. And we gave you the example of that decision-making matrix that can support families as they try and figure out who's deciding what. But also, the person who has spent their career in the business and then all of a sudden they're not going to be that person anymore. So how do we support them as well? So, it's really important to be mindful of the passing of that baton and having someone be ramping up while the next person is, has to ease off, but and we want to do that in a supportive and meaningful way.
Absolutely. The one thing I'd say about authority is, you will have some board members, some executives or other things that do remember you when you were wearing knee socks. They do remember you when you are not your best version of yourself. So this authority transition, it's earned. And it's not earned in your newfound competence. It's earned in helping them see this new version of you. This is hard in families. This is hard in long-standing relationships. There's something called associative regression, where my brain just wants to remember about 7 to 10, let's call it Polaroids of each person. And our brain is also 4 to 7 times more negative. So you've got to remember that you're replacing those Polaroids that are old and outdated. And so this is the most murky, the most careful, the most painstaking process of all of these succession components. The rest of those are pretty easy. They're pretty directive. They're pretty documented. But this one takes a little longer. And just know that you're really working on earning it with people, and that doesn't have any reflection on you.
Yeah, and it's also, the employees get really used to going to one person, and I've worked with countless families where, they've sort of figured it out, and the senior person is maybe going to Florida or going away for several months out of the year as a way to gradually step back and letting their successors rise up and take authority and make those decisions. But then when they come back from Florida, everyone goes back to them and goes back to asking them the questions. So I think it's a mindset that both the main actors need to be aware of, but also how are you going to communicate that to the rest of your employees and to everyone else around you? And so I think there's a piece of it that is not just what I'm internalizing and what I know, who is the ultimate decision maker, but communicating that. Maybe it's a family statement. Maybe it's showing up, as Natalie said, in a way that makes it clear in a gentle, kinder way, right? Not with an iron fist, but so that everyone can accept that this is the new way it's going to be. This is our new paradigm. And, the last point here, are we governed by principles or personalities? We've built this business. We have this successful business. And it's not all about one person, or it's not all about the person who was sitting in the seat. It's what we stand for. It's what we stand for as a family, what we stand for as an organization. And so how can we all live up to that and help communicate that to everyone involved and all our constituents as well?
Absolutely. This isn't a succession only conversation with this comment, but we talk about how we hire for we hire for talent, we fire for personality. And that may be true. I actually was working with a client a couple of years ago where we had two daughters who were the successor candidates, and one was the more charismatic leader. One was the one that was liked more, but wasn't actually very capable. However, the client that wasn't as charismatic, who was very capable, wasn't interested in being more gregarious and charismatic. And so we actually did hire a Mr., because that's who we found, a Mr. outside CEO for about 5 years before we were able to get one of the two to do better. And the one that needed to do better was the one who didn't think it was important, because I'm very good at doing this, to be as gregarious and charismatic. And it was important. I just saw we have a question, Shelley, that came through. It says, are there outside forces that can make the authority component more difficult?
Yeah, I would say, so outside forces, not just others who were like related to the constituent business, but wonder what kind of, how do you interpret that, outside forces?
Yeah, especially if you're talking about legacy companies or family companies. Some people come on these webinars and say, we're not a family company, it's just me and myself, right? So we're talking about privately held companies. A lot of these are from charismatic leaders. Now, it's actually really interesting that not all are charismatic. Some are very introverted. We find that successful, but they create a culture, right? Not all good, right? I just was working with a client a few months ago where we had to have this whole session on this founder entrepreneur who's now deceased, on how talented and how wonderful they are, but also they were kind of a jerk. And we can hold those inconsistent truths together. And so what do we do sometimes when we model successors after founders, as we behave that way as well? And so one of the things about the current person in that role who is talented and is not as intense as that deceased founder was, there's still some intensity that reminds people of that. And so people sometimes can't hear that person because it feels more intense. And so those outside forces, Shelley, yes, sometimes they are your stakeholder group, your customers. They have to have all this authority as well, your C-suite leaders and your other rank and file employees. But some of it is that legacy of that founder entrepreneur, living or deceased. And we don't tend to hire exact fingerprints. We think that successors should be exact. We hire complementary. But in those overlaps, we want to make sure those overlaps are ideally the more positive and less problematic parts of that behavior. And that's where you can lose authority real quick. You might, research says we have a favorite child. I know you don't want to believe me and you're not going to admit to your kids who they are. But that favorite child is either just like you because you love yourself so much, or the child so opposite you that you really admired they could conquer your bad behavior. And so sometimes we've left a legacy around authority that next gen really has to contend with. And part of that is actually addressing that, mapping it, and either moving with it or moving outside of it. Hopefully that answers your question. If it didn't, discuss again in a different way.
Yeah, and here's something else related that I was thinking about. So a family that I know created a whole sort of a document around behaviors and what it means to work in a family business. And so these might be some outside forces at play, the baggage that you bring with you because your family name, that might be an internal force. But what does it mean? How do you show up? And we're going to touch on this a little bit in transitioning of values and relationships as well. When you're a family member and your name is on the door, people have a thought about you as being born into this family or having a silver spoon or just being handed this opportunity. So what does that mean to the family member who needs to earn the authority, earn the respect, show up, right? You need to be a hard worker. Maybe you're not going to have exactly the same work style as someone who's 30 or 40 years older than you, because as we already acknowledged earlier in this conversation, there's a little bit of different view of work style and work ethic. Millennials and younger generation people, they might leave at 4 o'clock, but they're going to be on their computers at 8 o'clock too. And it's a different way of working. But the other people around you, whether they're in the business, long-term employees, or other key constituents, they need to see you showing up and putting in that effort. And actually, maybe, your parents or your uncles or aunts, they need to see it as well so that they have the confidence in you. So I think a family discussing what it means to be a next generation leader and what's required to show up is important for family members to understand as they step into those roles.
Absolutely.
So then when we talk about values, right? So these are things that we want the business has its values, the family has its values. Sometimes they're going to be similar. They're not all going to be exactly the same, but we want everyone to understand what those are. And if you're leading the business, you can't do a 180 with the business. You're going to lose a lot of employees. You're going to lose a lot of customers. And chances are, if you grew up in the family who has already been working in this business, either as founders or leaders over the generations, chances are you're going to embody a lot of those values and those will be embedded in you as well. But how you show up is also one of those values, and how the person who wants to hand over the reins to you, they want to see that you're going to treat the company like they treated the company. And those are sometimes important conversations to have and hard conversations to have. I see families where the person is not going to let go because they don't think that their child or their niece or nephew is going to show up at 8 in the morning and, turn out the lights after everyone else has gone. And that's how they did it. And they worked 24/7 while they were raising young families. And so they don't understand the different way of looking at it. So conversations around those values and what it means to everyone involved, I think, are really important. And then, Natalie I know you have a lot to say on this topic as well.
Yeah, as you're talking, Shelley, it's just reminding me, again, we're talking exit period. 70% of people regret the sale of their business, according to the Business Exit Institute. But it's not the purchase price, interestingly enough. It's that they're living to see their values change. That really is what most people worry about. And we've also studied this about all the different reasons founders have a hard time stepping away, all to Shelley's point. And there are many people who are not in the family company who don't exactly espouse those values. And that's where, the family values, similar to what I said about successors, they're usually complementary, not mirror images. Family values will be complementary. If you have family investments, they'll be complementary too. In fact, sometimes you have a really high risk taking business and you have a low risk investment portfolio as you're balancing it. We also sometimes have families philanthropy that could be run through their company's CSR or through their donor advised fund. And so it's mapping those, it's making those unseen things seen. I believe we did a webinar a little bit on conflict not too long ago, Donnell and I. But one of the things that we talked about in that is we have values and motivators that we don't actually articulate. We tend to articulate behaviors. The conflict that's going to arise when you have this more diffuse, spread out governance, joint decision making type thing, because mom and dad, or mom or dad, or again, grandma, grandpa, insert names here, tend to be like lighthouses, right? They're that light that doesn't allow us to crash on the rocks on the outside. And they're doing that because they're living these values, whether they're talking about that or not. And so we really want to map these. We want to collaborate on them. And studies show families have about, 12 to 15 values. About 8 of those are the same. The order might be different though. And it's okay if you don't have all the same ones as your family. But when we're behaving as a group, we're deciding to continue to espouse these values. So believe it or not, this is a great tool for families to individuate. You hear a lot about being interdependent and being collaborative, but for families to flourish, we also need to, as individuals, feel our freedom is there. And it's making sure we don't really track on these values in a way that doesn't work for us.
Hey, oops, sorry, went too far. Let's move on to knowledge. And so this is that chart that we showed earlier, right? How are we going to make sure that we're transmitting and transferring all the knowledge that we need to? And first is like, what's the important knowledge? What do we need to make sure the next people in this position are going to know? This is throughout the organization, right? People do it all the time in their businesses. It's not just the top spot. It's not just the key leader spots. It's throughout. And when we talk about the mentoring, right? So that can be a great tool for that operational knowledge, and relationships figure into this as well. We'll talk about that. But what do people really need to know, and how does the knowledge get from one place to the next, even within the current structure? And then we need to figure out how are we going to transfer that knowledge in the next phase of the operation. And one of the things that sometimes hard, especially for that person who's been living all those 3 circles themselves, wearing all the hats, is to think about, what are those big decisions? What are those things that I consider when I make those decisions? How do I go about, not just the little tasks every day, but the bigger thinking stuff? And so shadowing is a great opportunity. Having a regularly scheduled meeting without a particular agenda, where it's just, what is the stuff that comes to mind? So it's sort of getting inside the brain and being able to find out all the little things that we might not even be thinking about, but we're doing. And how is how do you set your successor up for success by giving them a window into that? And so having, that opportunity to peel back those layers and sort of get behind the curtain, if you will.
Absolutely. We are going to show you a tool in a minute that you can use that talks about how we track the decisions that are being made. The challenge of the person who does it all is you don't even know when you're doing it, right? There are questions that come up daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, sometimes every 5 years, every 15 years. This is a silly example, but one of my clients, that was a very large family, I don't know, 12 siblings or something like that. So there's such an age spread. But when the eldest, sibling retired, the youngest sibling became the CEO, and he used to be the CTO, the chief technology officer in his lifetime. And the power went out one day, and they actually work in the perishables business, and no one could figure it out. They were calling all these electricians. It also happened to be during a heat wave. Whole big story. And he's like, let me look at it. And everyone's like, this is not worth your time. But he actually knew where the plug was, and someone had actually kicked the plug out of the door. It's that kind of stuff that is really hard to track. And so we have job aids to do that. There's a lot of tools, and really finding a way to help jog those memories. And yes, was this below the CEO's pay grade? Absolutely. And yet he was the only person in the building who could figure this out. And it wasn't, it's that old adage of like, have you tried turning it on and off? There just was a master power switch someone kicked in the warehouse.
So here we put up this diagram. We're actually going to throw in the chat. I don't know if Casey's put those in, but we'll definitely do it before the webinar's over. We have 3 PDFs with examples of both the decision matrix that we talked about earlier, two different examples of that, and then this mapping knowledge and information flow. And there's a little bit of, there's some instructions or some details about how to use this, which you'll get in the PDF version. But this is really helpful for a family to go through. I know that it's a real eye-opener when you have a group of, I think I did it last time, and there were maybe 15 of them sitting around, and it really lines up generationally. Like the rising generation thinks that the senior generation knows everything that they're doing. But then when the senior generation, that they think that they're communicating everything to each other and everything's moving smoothly. When the when the senior generation maps their own flow of information, they don't think that they're getting all the information. So it's very interesting to see everyone's perception of how everyone else is getting the information is not the same as what that group actually thinks. I don't know if I made that clear as mud. Maybe Natalie will help me out on that one.
Absolutely. We tend to do this exercise either individually or by group, and then we track where they think the breakdown is. And it's kind of the not me syndrome, right? It's not where I'm breaking it down. This gets even more complicated if we add in personality. Extroverts forget that they're not telling people. If I had a conversation with Shelley in the morning, then had one with Casey and one with Donnell, I assume Shelley knows everything. She doesn't know I've changed my mind too. So absolutely, when we have different stakeholder groups do this, they will say the log jam is somewhere else. And the truth is we're all complicit and not effectively figuring it out. But then we're also all able to be that solution. 100%, Shelley.
Yeah. So we're moving along with time. So we're going to talk about relationships here. And we can look at relationships and transitions from multiple angles. One is, who are the people who you have important relationships with, or who your parents or aunts or uncles or whomever have important relationships that you need to know. You need to know so that you can keep those communication lines open. Or maybe they're actually not the relationships that you're going to have going forward. So maybe you need to find other people who are going to serve you. Maybe these people are aging out. Maybe they're great and you have great relationships with them, but maybe you need to find the next generation of advisors. Similarly, with the other key constituents, whether they're important vendors or clients or other people really important to the organization, we need to make those introductions. We need to have lunches or meetings or outings or, whatever the ways that those relationships were developed previously. Those might not be the same activities you're going to do, but it's important to know who those people are and then develop your relationship on your own terms with those people so that everybody knows who the key players are, both inside and outside. And then I think super important, and this is the way looking at relationships a little bit differently. This is when you have the cousins, the siblings, whomever coming into the business. How are they going to work together as a team? Whether it doesn't have to necessarily be co-leadership roles, but you're all going to be in it together. This is where I also find the decision-making matrix helpful, a slightly different version than we showed you before, but I'm pretty sure you have it in the chat now. A way for this group, a family that I worked with, actually developed their own model, their own way of doing it, because they realized there were some real breakdowns in just knowing about what was going on and who's supposed to make the decisions. When mom used to do everything, now how do we know who does what? And wait, you made that decision, but you didn't tell me. So this is a way for them to have a structure that they feel really comfortable and confident with, as a way to make decisions and to protect and develop their relationships with each other as the next group that's going to run the company. Natalie.
Couldn't have said it better, Shelley. These stakeholders, we do, again, when we think about how we started this conversation, when we think of succession, it's just management succession, but it's really the entire enterprise and all those ways that make it successful. And there's a reason you have a team of advisors that probably haven't yet met your adult children. And there's a part of the adult children too I want to pick on, not just the founder entrepreneurs, is you might say, I don't want those old guys. I would want to also know what my advisor's succession plan is, right? Because they probably do know this thing. What I can tell you about all the family companies I've seen literally all over the world, they have some really complicated structures. They have some of the best accountants, attorneys, financial advisors. And I'm not saying the next generation can't pick their own. Absolutely, if you need to. And you still want to do that transition smoothly. You still want to make sure that that works out very well. And that all supports the functioning of the entire enterprise, which is the vehicle for the financial wealth of the family. And we don't want that to get lost, especially when we're grieving. I still do to this day work with clients that die at their desks, and that actually makes them happy. They love that. So imagine a world where you're grieving someone you cared for, that lighthouse, and everything is also a mess. We don't want to start orienting and creating these relationships and this authority and all of these things at the worst, most devastating, chaotic times of our lives. So start those conversations now, even if you think it's way down in the future.
Yeah, that's a super good point. So we want to leave you with just what you can do now, right? Natalie, I'll let you.
Yeah, there's resources, tools, and structures. We've given you a few. There's a couple more videos that'll be on our website and attached to this email. And the resources, the reason these are really important is, one, they're based in research, which is super important to me because I like it. But two, a process and a protocol and a program makes it not feel personal. When this thing happens, that may not be the thing that everyone agrees with, but at least we know that it was acted out in a measured, studied way, equitably to everyone. This wasn't about me. And so that's where these can really help you. It also helps you sometimes zoom out and look at this from a different lens because you're living it, right? And then the last thing is start planning before you think it's time. Many of my clients in the last 10 years or so, which was not the case when I started 10 years before that, are proactively planning. Many others have reached out based on a terminal illness or a cognitive degeneration where we really can lose this valuable information. This is all saying, and that's the fear of founder entrepreneurs, I'm not valuable anymore. I'm not relevant anymore. The truth is you are incredibly valuable. You're incredibly relevant. And let's help us get that while there's time. Right. And you've got to communicate more than you think. Over communicate. It's going to feel like we're ripping your teeth out of your face because secrecy is often how founder entrepreneurs have been successful. Sorry, Shelley, I heard you.
No, that's okay. You didn't see my slides advancing, so I didn't want to surprise you that there were more.
Yeah. And this last one, too often we say things like, I don't want my kids to know for this reason, or I don't want them to know for that reason. But when we really do the work, when we really ask you the questions, a lot of times you don't want them to know because you have a hard time articulating it. You have a hard time with this conversation. And so it is work. It feels uncomfortable, but it will be better after.
Yeah. And one of the things that sort of ties a bunch of these together is when you have those conversations, when you use the resources and tools and create your own, right? If some advisor or, one of our webinars or some website, you see something and you're like, not exactly right, develop your own. And what's beautiful in that is when the family creates it together and is able to have those conversations together, then you all have that buy-in, and as Natalie said, it's something to look back on. If something goes wrong, it's like, oh yeah, this is the way we wanted to do it. I remember we all agreed on that. So that's where the communication and the planning and all of those things really really tie well together. And I think we're just at the top of the hour here. It's been great spending time with you, Natalie, and everyone else here online. And we are going to have some bonus content that will come out, and we'll link to that. We're going to tell you how to use those tools and matrices so that you understand them fully. And with that, well, thank you all for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks everyone.